Pokemon is everywhere, whether that be due to the latest hype about the upcoming game, or hearing about yet another fight at Target over cardboard, or through living and breathing the games yourself. It's undeniable that ever since its humble introduction in the late 90s, the presence of Pokemon has exploded beyond its digital confines and into our world. However, along with being the most popular franchise in history, Pokemon has also been known for its plethora of mistakes. The Mew glitch in Gen 1, tweaking in Gen 4, or straight up falling out of the world in Gen 9 have become notorious in the gaming world. But today, I want to dig deeper. Instead of focusing on the grand, game-breaking quirks that we all know, I want to explore the hidden errors in Pokemon, ones that you probably have never noticed or even heard of before. Some are so inconsequential that calling them an oversight is almost pointless. But regardless, I want to talk about these slightly loose screws in the engine that prove even the greatest in the world can make the exact same earthly mistakes. Let's start this video with some textual errors, because I think these are pretty difficult to notice unless you seriously go out of your way to read everything. And who does that? It's common knowledge that when referring to a Pokemon as a group, you always refer to them in singular form. For example, you'd say a group of Wooper, or all Magcargo are considered horses, without adding the S at the end. But did you know that this wasn't always the case? Interestingly, there have been a few select instances where Pokemon were properly pluralized. Of course, most of these cases were in the Gen 1 games. For example, Magneton's red and blue dex entry states that it's formed by several Magnemites linked together. We also see this in another multiplication evolution, Wheezing, stating that two Coughings can fuse into a Wheezing. One trainer in Pewter City even mentions seeing the Clefairies on Mount Moon, only for it to be mysteriously changed in the remakes. I think you get the point. In Gen 1, it seems like all Pokemon just used standard pluralization, but when did this rule stop? Well, this same quirk also occurs in the early eras of the TCG. This is mostly because many of the Gen 1 cards' entries are just copied from the games, but there are a few unique entries, like Dark Machoke from Rocket, that also normally pluralize the Pokemon's name. After some searching, I think the latest instance of a card that had this plural form was Dark Executor from Neo Destiny, all the way in 2002, where it stated that a fallen head searches for other executes. The card also weirdly has Executor's name misspelled, which I'm not sure how that slid through the final quality check. But thankfully, that seems to be the end of this grammatical era. If it wasn't for Sun and Moon randomly bringing this back 15 years later, where Samson Oak asks the player if they've caught one of the local Persians. Okay, at this point, I'm just gonna believe that calling Pokemon Pokemons is just a form of slang. I don't know why I decided to look into this so much, but with that, I think we've reached the end of a rabbit hole that has absolutely zero payoff whatsoever. Well, hopefully you at least found it somewhat cool. Let's move on to some oversights with moves. This one's slightly more influential because you probably do take some time to read a new move's description. In over 99% of cases, what a move is described to do and what it actually does are the same. What a shocker. But there were a few instances where Game Freak strangely gave erroneous descriptions or stats to moves. Take the move Vital Throw, for instance. It's a 70 base power move that never misses, but the accuracy is shown as 100%, implying that evasion changes can make it miss, which it can't. This specific error is found in a lot of status moves throughout Gen 3, like Helping Hand and Soft Boiled. Another weirder example of a stat being wrong is with the move Nature Power, which supposedly has a 95% accuracy. The thing is, Nature Power itself isn't an attack. It calls out a different move depending on the terrain, making that accuracy stat meaningless. The weirdest part is that Game Freak fixed this specific oversight in Fire Red and Leaf Green, and then reverted it back in Emerald. Definitely a head scratcher. But the biggest offenders are the few examples of descriptions being flat-out lies, of which I found two. First is Razorwind in Fire Red and Leaf Green, which apparently is supposed to have an increased crit ratio, which it doesn't. At least it doesn't in Gen 3, which ironically is the one generation that removed that effect. Not that the crit rate makes it any better. But then there's Miracle Eye in Diamond and Pearl, claiming to allow the user to always hit ghost types, when the move actually allows the user to always hit dark types with psychic attacks. In all fairness, these two moves are ones you'd probably never use at all anyway, so really nothing of value was lost. The opening scene. For most, it's something that you repeatedly mash the A button for to skip it and get to the game. After all, who has the time to watch a 1-minute trailer of the game every time they boot it up? But if you've taken the time to watch all of them, you might have noticed that a few showcase some things a bit different from the actual games. Specifically, each of the Gen 4 scenes have a few things off about them. In the Sinnoh intros, a few NPCs and objects have been altered. For example, in Route 204, the trainers are all positioned differently from how they actually are in the game. And in Eterna Forest, the Moss Rock is completely absent for some reason. In Heart Gold and Soul Silver, a few buildings and structures are different, like the fence by Professor Elm's lab being absent, and the shrines in Ekritik City having different colored roofs. There's also a scene showcasing the 3 starters, featuring a Cyndaquil sprite that doesn't exist anywhere else in any of the Gen 4 games. This is probably due to the opening intros being created sometime during the beta stages of development and not being revised later. Although, honestly, it's something that only the most observant of players probably would be able to catch. Okay, this is a really small one, but I thought it was kind of interesting to point out. We all know that N is the fastest speaking character in the entire series. He's the only character to speak at a text speed higher than what's selectable in the options menu. However, interestingly, there's one instance where an NPC has been able to speak slower than what is normally possible. In the northernmost house in Driftvale City, there's an old lady to the left who, when talked to, speaks noticeably slower than what you'd expect. I remember the first time I talked to this NPC for no reason other than pure curiosity, and thinking that this was some sort of weird intentional design, since they're old. But every other old NPC speaks normally, so it's just a random oversight that causes this single character to talk like this. As far as I know, there aren't any other NPCs in the entire series who have this glitch, but if you found any other instances, I'd be pretty stoked to know. Next up, we have a pretty cool one that a fan sent in. In Gen 4, we got the Type Berries, which allowed you to take 50% less damage from a super effective move for one turn. This was a pretty nice defensive addition to Pokemon who were 4 times weak to a certain type, like Tyranitar to fighting moves and Gyarados to electric moves. That's cool and all, but there's an interesting little quirk that only existed in the Gen 4 games that involved the move Endure. You see, if you had a Type Berry and used Endure, instead of losing half of the HP that you would have lost, or going down all the way to 1 HP, you'd be left with half of whatever amount of HP you had before being hit. That means that if you're at full HP and endure a super effective hit that would have taken you out, you'd have 50% of your max HP, even though numerically it should be 1. This is apparently due to how Endure functions in Gen 4, capping the total damage taken to your remaining HP minus 1, but applying that effect before the Type Berry kicks in. I'm not sure if there's any practical usage for this, but it's still a weird little mechanic exclusive to the Gen 4 games. Thanks a lot to Josephine Lilith for mentioning this one. Have you ever wondered what's the least amount of damage you can possibly do in Pokemon while still attacking? Like, let's imagine a level 1 Chansey attacking a level 100 Shuckle with something like Pound. That's gotta deal no damage, right? Well, Game Freak graciously made it so that no matter how weak your attacks are, you'll always deal at least 1 point of damage. It's kind of touching in a way. Like their way of saying, you may not be there yet, but you put in the effort to attack. That's all that matters. However, it turns out that in all of Pokemon's history, there have been 2 very situational ways to actually deal 0 damage while still attacking. The first was, of course, all the way back in red and blue, where if you used an attack that's 4 times resisted by an opponent, and your attack stat was incredibly low compared to their defense, like a Weedle versus an Onyx, the game would simply say that the attack missed. But even if you spammed the attack over and over again, it would just keep missing. So it's not that the move is really missing, but you're dealing so little damage that the game doesn't know what to say. But there's also a lesser known way to achieve this same result, which just so happens to be in the very best generation, again, Gen 5. For some reason, while the damage calculation mostly works normally, it calculates halving effects like Reflect and Multiscale after the final rounding, meaning that if you have an incredibly defensive Pokemon that also knows Reflect and have it set up, if the opponent is weak enough, you will lose 0 HP. Unlike Gen 1, however, the game acts as if the move hit, but the HP bar doesn't go down. Obviously, the likelihood of you actually stumbling upon one of these situations is near 0, but it's pretty cool seeing a Pokemon deal so little damage that the game recognizes it as absolutely nothing. The world of Pokemon is one that seems as if it was made just for you. It's a world that unfolds uniquely based on the player, a world that lets you play however you want and be whoever you want. But the reality is, as with all things in life, there are always barriers. In life, they may be psychological or financial, and in Pokemon, well, they're probably just an endless ocean of trees. To end things off, I want to talk about the barriers that exist in Pokemon, and more importantly, the existence of broken barriers, what I like to call ghost tiles. They're the remnants of arguably the biggest oversight that any developer could possibly make, because one wrong move, and you could find yourself walking through a rock, teleported to a house that doesn't exist, or be completely erased from the Pokemon world. We'll start off with the Gen 2 games, which, while they don't have any ghost tiles, do have something pretty peculiar hidden beyond the border in one city. Olivine doesn't appear to be super noteworthy at first, really only being special for the SS Aqua, which allows you to travel to Kanto and back. However, if you were to walk through the trees, in the top left corner lies a single warp tile that leads to a secret house. Inside, the woman talks about the Ekritique Pharmacy, which implies that perhaps Cianwood City was originally not meant to exist at all. In order to access this house, you would need to hack the warp tile as well, which makes it all the more bizarre why out of all of the lost Gen 2 content, this one insignificant house was never removed. I guess, in a way, it's become the most fascinating thing in all of Johto because of that. Perhaps we could have gotten a less depressing Kanto if the developers took the time to remove it. In a similar vein, I also discovered some interesting random objects in Pokemon Black and White. With the walkthrough walls cheat, in the P2 laboratory, by walking directly south of the exit, there's a random assortment of tables and trash cans in a white room. I'm not sure why they're here, as neither the table or trash can are anywhere in the actual lab, so it's not like some internal storage. I'm guessing that perhaps the lab was originally going to serve some greater purpose in the plot, but was eventually scrapped and pretty much left as an out-of-the-way Easter egg in the final game. I'm not aware of there being any other instance in the Unova region where there's a cluster of random stuff lying around the outer edge of a room. But now, let's go over some actual ghost tiles and instances where you or someone else can walk beyond the game's barriers. In the Gen 3 games, it's pretty well known that there are a few trainers who will go to absurd lengths to battle you, so much so that they'll walk through walls to reach you. This strangely only occurs in the English versions, where a few trainers were given slightly further sight, probably to create some double battle traps. It's pretty funny and unexpected when you think you've outsmarted a trainer, and then they just phase through a solid wall to talk to you. However, what about you being able to phase through walls? Well, this is actually possible in a few select locations, notably in Gens 3 and 5. For example, in Ruby and Sapphire only, there's a specific tile in Sootopolis City that can be walked on, despite being intended to be a solid slope. In the same city's gym, you're able to walk into the wall behind the bottommost ladder. However, the coolest glitches happen underwater. You see, the diving mechanic can be a bit buggy, which is probably why it became almost non-existent outside of Hoenn. Specifically, if you perfectly timed the B button when walking into a door, the game would ask you if you wanted to return to the surface, which, if you chose to do so, would result in some pretty cool things, like being able to walk on water and even trapping yourself in an out-of-bounds part of the ocean. Lastly though, there are quite a few tiles in the Gen 5 games that can be walked through. In the 7th gym in black and white, there's this rock that can be walked through, allowing you to avoid the final trainer, which might actually be helpful if you're doing a speedrun. In the 8th gym, things get even weirder, with tiles that let you walk on air, and even a single invisible tile that can be surfed on in the Japanese versions. If you for some reason choose to save the game, you're permanently stuck there, with no option but to either use a cheat code or accept your fate and restart the game. In the sequels, we see a few more cases of ghost tiles. These specific trees here in the giant chasm can be walked through, letting you pick up this item, and on Route 19, this part of the cliff can be walked into, making you pretty much invisible. But I know what you're asking, why? Who cares about these minor errors that almost nobody will find in a normal playthrough? Well, I think these mistakes highlight just that about Pokemon. Nobody really cares about the minor missteps you make. Sure, Scarlet and Violet being released as a glitchy mess is probably a bit too far, but besides them, older Pokemon games have always had their fair share of glitches, some being unintended mechanics like the Badge Boost glitch or Mew glitch, and some, like these, just being fun discoveries that give a wow factor in a game that we think we know all too well. But the fact remains that this is Pokemon. This is the game we all grew up knowing and loving, despite their flaws and their small issues. Should they be taken note of and fixed in the future? Absolutely. But the point is, if you can forgive Pokemon for its small mistakes, I'm sure you can forgive yourself for yours too. Don't be too hard on yourself there. It's an adventure.